few weeks ago, Primus was supposed to be a Gladiator dungeon crawler. Then I started adding more systems, changing the combat, and making it more historically accurate, building out dialogue, festivals, and other Gladiator houses. And somewhere along the line, I think I actually lost the actual game. The weird part is that AI made all of this easy to build, but that also made it very easy to bloat the project with ideas I hadn't properly thought through. So this week, instead of adding more features, I spent a lot of time deleting them, and honestly, I think the game is better for it. So Primus is a gladiator game where you manage a house of fighters and then send them into brutal combat, with the crowd playing a very big role in terms of what happens with each fight. Originally, the idea was pretty simple. I wanted to make a gladiator dungeon crawler heavily inspired by Darkest Dungeon, but with my own twist. Instead of just exploring dangerous areas and fighting enemies, the arena crowd would influence combat. They could, they could cheer, demand blood, trigger events, reward exciting moments, and hopefully make the run feel like you were performing for an audience, not just clearing rooms. That was the vision. But as I kept developing it, I started getting more interested in the historical side of gladiators. I wanted the game to feel more authentic. I started thinking more about the actual arenas, gladiator houses, festivals, preparations, rival leaders, etc. And none of them was necessarily a bad idea. I think the game should be more historically accurate. But what I found is that the more I tried to make it historically accurate, the less the dungeon crawler idea seemed to fit. Why would gladiators be, wandering through dungeon rooms like adventurers, when in reality they should be performing at festivals and in the arena? And so the dungeon crawler then began to turn into more of a gladiator simulator, where I changed the combat to be, instead of, the Darkest Dungeon style, to be more tile-based. I started making scenes around festival preparation and conversations with other head of houses. And again, I don't really think that was a terrible idea, but I think I was more making those decisions because it felt more accurate, not because it was the actual game I wanted to make. And after sitting with it for a while, I realized that the original dungeon crawler idea was still the thing I was actually more excited about. It might not be the more realistic version of a gladiator sort of game, but it gave the project a clear identity, the identity that I wanted. And so, a run-based gladiator game where you take fighters into combat, try to survive, impress the crowd, and slowly build your house into something stronger, that just felt more fun to me. So I ended up reverting back to the dungeon crawler version, and because I'm using AI to help build this game, reverting the broad direction actually wasn't as painful as it could have been. The more difficult part was dealing with everything AI had helped me build along the way. But this is one of the strange things about using AI for game development. It makes implementing ideas really fast. Normally, if I had an idea for a system, I might have to stop and think, is it actually worth spending lots of time building? But actually, or at least, for normal developers. But with AI, it's very easy to think of something, turn it into a prompt, queue it up, and suddenly there is another system in the project. And because each individual idea feels possible, you don't always need to stop to ask whether it belongs to the game right now. And that was the position I found myself in. And a lot of systems that were technically in the game, but not properly finished. When you have enough half-baked systems in the game that have sort of just sat there in the project, the game starts to feel less like a game and more just a pile of ideas. And so this week, it was basically a cleanup week. I deleted a lot. The entire festival preparation scene is gone. The entire dialogue interactions with head of house is gone. A lot of script and unfinished features have been removed and put to the side. Now, some of these things might come back later. I still think there are some interesting ideas in there, but I'm about a week and a half from submitting the demo. And at this point, the game really doesn't need more possibilities, it needs clarity. The demo needs to actually show what Primus is, and I think right now that basically means stripping it down to the parts that really matter most. Taking the gladiators into fights, making the decisions during the run, experiencing the crowd events, and eventually reaching, the Gatekeeper bosses. I think that's enough, right? And in fact, I honestly think one of the biggest things I'm learning from this project is that AI can make games become far more complex without necessarily making them more enjoyable. And, I'm playing Darkest Dungeon again as inspiration, and I do think it's a great game. But there are also parts in it that can feel extremely punishing or difficult to control. Things, for example, like the personality quirks and long-term negative effects that build up on your characters. Understand why those systems exist. I think they're probably part of just, the tension in the game. But for Primus, I don't necessarily want to keep adding systems because I think, I like, I don't know. I think part of it is like I want there to be more meaningful decisions. I want the player to care more about their gladiators. And, I want the crowd to obviously be a big part in it as well. I don't really want the game to become something that's just genuinely frustrating, at least for the demo. I think really I just want to try and be able to prove that the core idea is fun. I think that that's something that I've struggled with before. I know when I was working on Scarred Steel, I ended up staying like up until like 2:30 in the morning, desperately trying to get the demo sort of, submitted, in time for the Steam Fest. Now, I know the situation, was obviously a bit different in terms of the tools I was using, etc. But I think what was similar is I was still trying to add stuff at the end. And I really don't want to do that. So I think just really for the next, honestly, week and a half, it is just going to be keeping my head down and trying to focus on actually, getting the right stuff like done for the actual demo. But I think really at the moment, what's key, at least for this week, has just basically been mostly getting the actual game back to where I want it to be in the first place, which is a dungeon, which is the Gladiator Dungeon Crawler, a game with serious fights, brutal runs, and a crowd that can change everything. It's smaller than the version, obviously, I've been trying to force together, a few weeks ago. But I think for the first time, it actually feels clearer. And with the demo getting very close, clarity is probably the most important feature I can add. So next comes the interesting part, which is probably going to be making the Gatekeeper bosses. So at the moment, the idea is that you'll recruit your gladiators, you will accept an invitation from a noble to perform at a certain game, or at least in this case, in a certain dungeon. And there will be varying waves. If you go a short circuit, you might have a fight, an event, and then a final fight, etc. And the idea is that after you perform and succeed at each of those circuits, you will rank up. You'll go from rank 100 to 98, for example, or 98 to 94, whatever. The idea is that at every 10, so at rank 90, 80, 70, there will be a Gatekeeper boss where you won't be able to rank up any further unless you defeat that Gatekeeper boss. And I'm not really sure exactly how I want to do it, whether it's randomized in terms of the roster, I don't know. But for the demo, at least, it will be looking at making those Gatekeeper bosses. Now, I do have varying ideas. Obviously, we don't just have gladiators in the game, we also have animals. One of the bosses will be a war elephant with archers on the back of them. I do already have that image in place and the sound effects and even some of the abilities. That's probably going to be a boss further down the line, but we're still figuring it all out from there. But yeah, we are pretty much about a week and a half away from just basically be able to submit our game in time for the Steam Fest. So it will be keeping our head down for that. I will be looking at releasing the Primus demo trailer probably next week. Or at some point closer to when I look to release the demo. So that's going to be interesting to do. I've already got the music and the voiceover and the sound effects done. I obviously just need the gameplay footage, which I will get when I am closer to having the demo done. So that's all interesting, at least for me, moving forward. But with that said, that's pretty much where we're at this week, and I'll catch you next week.